Hello, everyone. We are meeting again virtually to discuss various topics that you see in front of you. I'm waiting for there they are, for my subtitles to pick up. Welcome to the beginning of this week's lecture, in which we are going to be discussing the events of the late Roman Republic and the start of the Roman Empire. So we're going to see a switch occurring sometime in the middle of this lecture from Rome, who has historically, or at least since 509 BC, been organized as the Roman Republic with its respective offices. And it's going to switch into the Roman Empire. And if you remember where we left off during our last lecture, we have talked about the first triumvirate. Briefly, this triumvirate was formed in order to secure stability of the Roman Empire. I'm sorry, of the Roman Republic. We're still in the years of Roman Republic. So people, including Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had come together, and they had agreed to help each other in restoring the peace in Rome. Remember, restoration of peace was necessary because at this point we have seen engagement of political violence initiated by the reformer named Tiberius Gracchus and also Gaius Marius, who was one of the generals of the Punic Wars, who will engage in the reform of the military, which will kind of start off Roman Republic to turn into kind of militarized state, militarized republic, in which people will go against each other, seeking personal vengeance and seeking to rise up the social ladder through the ranks of the military, right? So the first triumvirate's purpose was to kind of come in and subdue the passions and subdue these rising competitions among the rising stars of Rome, right? But as we have learned as well, one of the people from the first triumvirate, Julius Caesar, he will seize the opportunity. And very much unlike the initial intent of the first triumvirate to bring the stability and restoring peace, he has done quite the opposite. Because as he was appointed to be representative in the Roman province of South Gaul, he will go on and conquer the entire province of the Gaul itself, so expand into the North Gaul as well. And upon the conquest of North Gaul, he will seek fame for himself. And upon the conquest of North Gaul, he will, he will send letters to Romans about all of his accomplishments and how he's done great battles in Gaul. And he will then famously march back with his army, marching back to Rome with an intent to proclaim himself a sole ruler. And he will do so in the year 59 BC, and he will march with his troops back to Rome. He will famously cross the so-called Rubicon River. An expression crossing the Rubicon River will become synonymous with kind of making a point of no return. And he will march there again with the intent to proclaim himself the sole leader of the Roman Republic. So here we are still speaking about Roman Republic. Now, he will expect some opposition from the Roman political establishment, of course. But at the time, the other two members of the first triumvirate, remember the Crassus and Pompey, they were actually out of the game because Crassus, he will die in one of the battles in the Middle East. And Pompey, seeing the rising fame of Caesar, he will start to fear Caesar and he will subsequently escape Rome. In this moment, in which Caesar marches with his army back to Rome, literally almost unopposed, will begin will mark the start of the civil wars in Rome. And essentially, the civil wars in Rome will be a point in which Caesar and Caesar's army will go against Pompey and Pompey's army. So here we have two individuals who were previously in one alliance in this first triumvirate going against each other. Now, how will it all play out? Well, Caesar will end up chasing Pompey's army all around Europe and Africa. And Pompey's army supporters were all over Europe, including places like Spain, including places like Greece. And eventually, Caesar's army will chase Pompey around, eventually pushing Pompey south to Egypt. And there, Caesar will actually follow Pompey's army to Egypt, and there Caesar will form kind of predictable alliance with Queen Cleopatra, who was kind of the pharaoh of Egypt at the time. And it was largely due to this alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar that Caesar's army will be victorious in this particular civil war. They will defeat Pompey's army and ending this power struggle between the two. And so, for the time being, Caesar's army will be victorious. So, he will be on the victorious side of the Roman civil wars. And Pompey, conversely, will be assassinated in Egypt. And Cleopatra and Caesar will not only be allied for political reasons, but they will also turn into lovers, even though Caesar was significantly older and was also already married. But there are many reasons why Cleopatra would side with Caesar at this point. But the reason why Cleopatra sided with Caesar politically and perhaps even romantically is that during the Roman Civil War, I said she was kind of, sort of, pharaoh, and I say this because she had to share her power with her brother, Ptolemy the 13th. So because she had to co-rule with her brother, she did not feel like sharing the power with her brother, and she wanted to be the supreme and only ruler in Egypt. And she thought that this alliance with Caesar in this civil war will actually help her oust her brother. So now, following Ptolemy's death, Caesar will march back to Rome, and upon his return, he will attempt to introduce some interesting measures, interesting changes to Roman society. He, for instance, will do such things as sponsor celebrations honoring his victories. And what's interesting to me is he will have coins made with his portraits and celebrating his victory. As you see on the slide, the Julius Caesar's denarius. Denarius was like an official mint or official coin or official currency of the Roman Republic at the time. This one's from 5th century. From the 1st century, from 47 to 48 BCE, when this mint was made. But he will also do other unprecedented things while he will be this leader of the Roman Republic. He will now also formally and legally proclaim himself as the sole and only consul. Remember that according to the Roman constitution, there ought to be 2 of the consuls. Well, he will change this rule, and he will officially proclaim himself as the dictator for life. So essentially, he will proclaim himself as being the only person in charge, and he even planned to abandon the elected positions of the Roman Republic, including the tribunes, and eventually also abandon Senate offices as well. And you can kind of imagine that the old patrician class of senators, of consuls, To them, this was a sound of the alarm. And to them, this very much sounded like the similar plot orchestrated decades ago by Tiberius Gracchus when he too, the tribune, he too wanted to get rid of all of the other offices and proclaim himself or leave the tribune as the only office of the Roman Republic, right? And so just like Tiberius, patricians saw Caesar to be a threat of these old republican system, and for that reason they will form a group or conspiracy against Julius Caesar and will plan to assassinate Caesars. And the conspirators will be led by two people, Brutus and Cassius, who were, of course, two patricians in favor of the traditional republic, and they opposed what they thought to be the very authoritarian, very pushy, very absolutist rule of Julius Caesar. And they will plan to attack Caesar during a session of a Roman Senate. And ultimately, the end result will be that Caesar will be assassinated on the March 15th in the year 44 BCE. And this date will also be known as the, quote, Ides of March. Ides referring to the Roman calendar, in which, the 15, the Ides, refers to being the middle of the month. And so Caesar will be stabbed on this day by being killed or stabbed multiple times by multiple senators during the Senate meeting. And interestingly, even though, this assassination was orchestrated by Brutus and Cassius, they were not the only ones who are stabbing Caesar in the back, because a lot of these senators, as the stabbing was occurring, a lot of them will come out. They will actually dip their hands in the blood flowing from Caesar's body, and they will kind of raise their hands up in the sky, pointing to the public that, we all, the senators, are actually, all of us collectively, acting in the self-defense. We are just senators kind of stepping up, defending the traditional offices of the Roman Republic against what we consider to be a bad tyrant, right? And to show this was an act not of an individual will, this is not an act of just Brutus and Cassius, this is all of us unanimously acting against Caesar. And this is kind of like an act of a Roman system defending itself, right? And the conspiring senators kind of believed themselves to be liberators, defending, again, the traditions of the Roman Republic. But guess what? In case, in this case, one murder will not kind of miraculously solve the problem. It will not restore peace miraculously. It will not restore back the tradition and order where they left it off before the civil wars itself. Because once you roll the ball of violence, of political violence in this case, and those responsible for the said violence and for said tyranny go unpunished, the cycle kind of continues. And even though conspirators wanted to go, the conspirators against Caesar wanted the Rome to go back to the, good old days of Roman glory, another civil war will come as a consequence of that. And this time, the war will occur between the Caesar's former supporters versus the Caesar's conspirators. And those in the war, in this new civil war, who supported Caesar, will form the so-called Second Triumvirate. And the members of this triumvirate were Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. And so the objective of these three, forming the second triumvirate, was to defeat or kill those people who conspired against Caesar. So the objective here is to revenge against Caesar's conspirators. Mark Antony, by the way, was Caesar's like a right hand. He was his assistant and lead lieutenant of his army. Octavian was Caesar's grandnephew, and Julius Caesar, actually adopted Octavian as his son. And Caesar, said Octavian is going to be my successor after I die. And Marcus Lepidus, he was also one of the generals of Julius Caesar. Now, these three first allies will, just like the first triumvirate before them, divide the territories of the Roman Republic kind of equally amongst themselves, with Octavian staying in the base. He will stay in Rome. Lepidus will be in charge of territories in North Africa, and Mark Antony will be placed in charge as the military protector of Egypt. But the story is kind of replicated in the second triumvirate as it was in the first, in that, just like in the first triumvirate, these three will start having competing interests, and they will continue to fight amongst themselves for power. So we have the same story all over again. Mark Antony, he, as I said, was in charge of Egypt. And there, after Caesar's death, he will fall in love with, you guessed it, Cleopatra, because Cleopatra will actually return to rule Egypt following the assassination of Caesar. And so there she was again in a romantic relationship, and in a diplomatic relationship of sorts, alliance with the person that she again thought would be the victorious party of this second civil war, in this second triumvirate. But ultimately, she will make the wrong call in terms of whom to align with, because it will be Octavian who will be securing the victory in this second civil war. So Octavian will be the victorious party of the second triumvirate. And in fact, the army of Mark Antony, and Cleopatra was defeated finally by the army of Octavian at the Battle of Actium. And Actium, by the way, was a place in Greece. And following their defeat, or following the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the two of them will flee to Egypt, where both of them will infamously commit suicide. And, Egypt was now formally destroyed, or rather conquered by Roman forces, conquered by the military power of Octavian. And so at the Battle of Actium, Octavian's army defeats the army of Cleopatra and Mark Antony in Greece. The two retreat back to Egypt, where they commit suicide, and Octavian conquers Egypt. And not only does he conquer Egypt, but he also proclaims himself, as Caesar kind of sort of did before him, as the sole ruler. And so now to take a brief pause to reiterate the significance of both of the Roman civil wars, of, both triumvirates, we can see how they have led to competition for political dominance. So this is all this is about, right? And these changes, if you remember from the previous lecture, were actually due to the military reform that was put in place by person Marius Gracchus, a person about whom we spoke of last week, because he will switch the Roman tradition from them being a voluntary army fighting for the glory of the Roman Republic into the professional army, fighting to impress your general and fighting for your own personal glory. And we've seen that this military reform was necessary initially to help the poor veterans of the old Punic War. But at the same time, reforms were also kind of carving the path for the rise of competition among these soldiers, among these generals, for dominance. And this, of course, disturbs the equilibrium of the Roman Republic. And now, instead of having or continuing with having the society that is kind of dependent on representatives in the offices of the Roman Republic, now we have a situation in which Roman Republic is turning increasingly militaristic. And this is significant because following the Battle of Actium, we can no longer speak of Rome as a republic because we are now speaking of Rome as an empire. And that is to say that from 509, when the Roman aristocrats, when the Roman patricians ousted the Etruscan king, so since 509 BCE to the year 27, BCE, we have Rome as a republic. But since the year 27 BCE, we have Rome as an empire. And so this triumph of Octavian at the Battle of Actium signifies the beginning of the Roman Empire. In this year, actually in year 27, so a few years after his victory at Actium, the Octavian will proclaim himself, quote, Augustus. So from here on out, if I say Octavian Augustus, I'm referring to the Augustus as being the officially a title. So if I say Augustus, this is kind of the equivalent of Caesar, meaning the only and the sole ruler. And so Augustus, literally the title itself, translates as the revered or as the admired ruler, right? Because that's what he, Octavian Augustus, was hoping to become. And actually, this is to give you an example, this is the kind of image that Augustus wanted to have portrayed of him. And during the Augustus's reign, Roman art, the sculpturing, was kind of closely intertwined with politics and propaganda. Here in just a second, we will see how Octavian Augustus will engage in propaganda program to bolster his image. But this is one of the examples. Here we see a statue of Octavian Augustus with this random baby hanging off his knee. This, by the way, is Cupid, the son of Venus, the goddess of love and sex. And so the purpose of this was to kind of portray that Augustus has this divine right to rule, meaning that, to show that Augustus too has descended from gods themselves. And the gods are kind of giving him this sovereignty to rule, just like Mesopotamian kings had claimed before him. And Augustus kind of was hoping to reconstruct what seems to have been this failing government. And his goal was to bring this long-term stability for Rome after decades of crisis and after decades of civil war. But the question now becomes, how do we ensure order and stability? What was Augustus's vision of peace, and how will he go around in exercising his power? And he will say that, in order to secure order and obedience, the old offices of Republic are certainly no longer doing us a service, because I, Octavian Augustus, cannot bring about the changes and the reforms that I want to bring about if I had to share power with others. And for that reason, he will establish himself as the only and the sole emperor. And ultimately, the English word emperor will be derivative of the Latin word imperator. And imperator dates back to the early years of Roman Republic, when senators will typically give this title, the title of imperator, to a general who had secured a large victory in the war. But Augustus will actually be the first person in Western history who will take this title, calling himself an emperor, by which he will mean I am the Republic's sole executive commander, right? And with that move, he was kind of establishing the framework, establishing precedents for history's future emperors. And now, because he was kind of the first to claim this title, he will discover that, there are really no established guidelines, no like book of conduct, no job descriptions on what it means to be an imperator, on what it means to be an emperor. So he said, well, I will just make rules as I go. And even though he was the only executive person in Rome, he will interestingly start his rule by convincing people that he is actually keeping the Republican offices, right? So he will initially keep the three branches of the Roman government, but the existence of the Senate, the existence of consuls and tribune offices were just this illusion that republic still existed, because everybody kind of knew that Augustus was in charge and that Augustus ruled by himself. So he will keep republican offices, but they had no real function. And in fact, Augustus will use the formal titles of the Roman Republic, such as consul, tribune, and senator, and he will occupy at all times at least one of these Republican offices in the state. For example, he will first conveniently proclaim himself as the tribune for life, proclaiming himself to be this champion of the plebeians, of the ordinary people, even though plebeians, ordinary people, never formally elected him, as they have been elected, as they have been electing their tribunes in the past when we had the Republic, right? He will also proclaim himself as the only consul, which meant that now he too was the army's supreme commander. He alone could declare war, proclaim peace. He could, decide where troops are going to be stationed, and he no longer has a second council vetoing his decisions, as it was the case when Rome was a republic, right? Interestingly, he will also proclaim himself Principes Civitas, which basically meant, or translated from Latin, as the first citizen of the state, which at the time was simply an honorary title. But over time, it will evolve into the title of quote unquote prince, meaning a person, again, who has the ultimate sovereign power or who is the only responsible ruler. So he used all of these different titles of the government as a cloak or a shield to prove that Rome on the paper still has the Republic, so that the change is not as drastic in the eyes of the Roman people, even though Augustus's power was absolutely absolute. And these offices these titles, these offices were just a tool of Octavian Augustus's absolute control. Now, the fact that his power was absolute also meant that Augustus will bring the system of government appointments entirely under his personal control. This in Rome will become known as the patron-client system. And so in Rome, this was important because this was like an informal system of patronage in which men would kind of promise their obedience to a person that is of higher ranking, in this case, Emperor Augustus, in exchange for his help in legal matters, political matters, financial matters, and things of that nature. So, what this meant in practice is that if you wanted Emperor on your side, if you wanted his protection, you had to agree with his policies in order for him to help you out, right? Also, if you were to work for the government at any capacity, Augustus would have to put his stamp of approval. So your opinions have to align with opinions of Augustus, or otherwise he fires you, he releases you from your duties. And the only path to seek influential positions in Rome, whether it be in the army, whether it be in the government, you would have to remain loyal to the emperor. And so this bond is the bond constructed to represent itself as beneficial for both parties, but as you can tell, it's always more beneficial for the emperor because he is the one kind of controlling, he's the marionette pulling all the strings, right? Or the master pulling the strings on the actual marionette. So how now we've seen all of these offices, this cloak, this tools of absolute control of Augustus. How did actually people feel about Augustus claiming so much power after being ruled for 5 centuries by the rules of republicanism, right? How did the Roman people see this switch from seemingly somewhat democratic system into something that's more military and dictatorial style, right? Honestly, people, for the most part, were kind of tired of decades of the civil wars and were tired of political and social instability. And for the most part, they were willing to overlook Augustus's absolute control. And among people who he had made happy the most will be the army, because he will make the reorganization of the Roman army a priority for him and for his reign. And also, he will turn it into a practical issue as well. And he was aware that he was aware of the land crisis which still existed, that we spoke about last week in the context of Tiberius Gracchus. And he understood that the poverty was an issue, that unhappy veterans were an issue, and Augustus wanted to return the favor to his loyal soldiers who helped him emerge as victorious in the Roman civil wars. And so, what he will do is he will pay his loyalists by using the tax money paid by the people living in these lands that Romans had conquered over the centuries. And he will also grant hefty bonuses, and he will give retirement benefits not only to his generals but for the people who supported him. And additionally, he will organize this land redistribution that Tiberius Gracchus has proposed decades ago, and he will give portions of the land in the Roman provinces, so all of these places that Romans had conquered during the years of the Republic, to the war veterans. And perhaps because of these benefits, citizen soldiers, we are in this situation again in which they are more loyal to the leader, Octavian Augustus in this case, than they are to the Roman Republic or the Roman ideals and values themselves, right? The army that Augustus developed was devoted to him as a person and not as the head of the Roman state, right? So we kind of are continuing with this topic or trope of the cult of the worshiping of the general. And another part of Augustus's army reform was the introduction of the so-called auxilia, or the auxiliary forces. And this will be a special legion of citizens who will live in all of these provinces conquered by Rome. And essentially, auxiliary forces, or the auxilia, were the citizens, the non-Roman citizens, who will literally join the army of Rome as quote unquote helpers, because auxilia in Latin translates as help, right? So auxilia were literally military forces of non-Roman citizens who are there to help out the Roman army. And these will, and the only way that these, say, ambitious provincial leaders could climb up the social ladder would be through, again, military service. And auxiliaries will also be paid money, even though less than a regular Roman citizen soldier. And they were also granted Roman citizenship after they retire. So, service of auxiliaries in the military forces was like a path to citizenship. Now, speaking of legacies and accomplishments, and how people felt about Octavian Augustus, we also have to mention that he was remembered, or perhaps the most remembered by his people, very fondly, and he was remembered as a successful leader because he will be the person who will establish, or he will initiate the start of Pax Romana. And Pax Romana literally translates as Roman peace. And so Augustus's reign was actually praised as this new golden age of peace and prosperity of Rome. And it's true because for approximately 200 years, which is how long the Pax Romana actually lasted, Rome will enter this period of relative political stability, relative peace, where Romans did not necessarily fight as much with one another. We don't have any major wars breaking out, right? And actually, what made Pax Romana possible, among other things, were the soldiers of the Augustus's army, and they will kind of be enforcing the Roman rule in all of these different places that came under Roman occupation, and they were the ones responsible, both auxiliaries, the non-citizen soldiers, and the regular Roman citizen soldiers. Both of them will be responsible for responding to things like any outbreaks of resistance to Roman power if it occurred throughout the Roman Empire itself. Okay, so Pax Romana, one of the legacies established by or initiated by Octavian Augustus. For the most part, during Pax Romana, there were no major wars. But if there were any, these were the wars of convenience, and wars waged in order to conquer even more territory, for Rome to broaden its borders now as an empire. So part of Pax Romana is also this sense of Rome needing to fulfill its manifest destiny, needing to fulfill or needing to broaden its borders to bring Roman culture, to bring Roman literacy, to bring Roman Latin language to the people whom Romans consider to be quote unquote barbaric and quote unquote savage, or essentially non-civilized. And one of the most significant legacies of Augustus's reign will be the Roman expansion in the northern and in the western parts of the Mediterranean or larger Mediterranean region. If you look at the map, if you look at the orangish color, these are the territories conquered by or until the death of Julius Caesar. And if you look at the territories conquered by the death of the Augustus, these include formally territorial conquest of Egypt, and also territorial conquest of the portions of Iberian Peninsula, the North Iberian Peninsula, so the completion of the conquest of Spain, as well as the portions of the Central Europe, including places like Bavaria and Austria, and portions of Gaul, France, as well as the territories in Illyria. Meaning today these are countries like Croatia, Serbia, Hungary, so in the Balkan Peninsula as well. And that is to say that in these territories, as a part of the Roman manifest destiny, will be that some of the first urban developments in most parts of Central and Northern Europe will actually be the cities established by the Romans and the cities established by the Roman auxiliaries. Because prior to the Roman conquest of these territories, you do have native peoples living there, but they didn't organize themselves in cities or have not had anyone to kind of come and conquer them and rule them as the sole leader, right? And actually, by the end of just Augustus's reign, by the death of Augustus, approximately 50 to 70 million people were now under the direct political control and direct cultural influence of the Roman Empire. And all of these cities, all of these territories under Roman Empire will kind of develop their own Romanized territories, Romanized cities, and adapt Roman culture as well. Augustus, as we see, Octavian Augustus, as we see, was quite powerful, and he understood that he must prove himself as a good leader in order for people who are living in all of these vast provinces, who were previously non-Roman citizens, and he had to convince them that he is actually a good ruler for them. And for that reason, he will engage in a propaganda project. So, the big takeaway from this lecture is going to be propaganda that Augustus wanted to establish in order to calcify, in order to strengthen his popularity among people in these newly added territories. And to secure the obedience and to secure support, he will resort to many different tools of propaganda, one of which was constructing the cult of the emperor worship called Roma et Augustus. So this was a cult, and by cult I mean a group of people who are feeling extreme dedication to a certain leader. And Augustus's cult consisted of the so-called the guardians of the state, who literally were the followers, considered to be these true patriots, the true worshippers of Augustus. But also, these followers are also acting as the protectors of the title of the emperor in general. So Roma et Augustus was about worship of not only Octavian Augustus, but was constructed to last forever. And so that anybody who is Augustus or the emperor after Octavian's death, he also is going to be worshipped. So we are worshiping the title Augustus rather than a particular person. And I should stop here and explicitly mention that Roma et Augustus will be deemed officially a state religion. So it's a religion of the Roman Empire. It's a religion because members will be required to dedicate special prayers for the well-being of Augustus, whoever the Augustus is at the time. And the emperor himself will also be acclaimed or acknowledged as God in a similar fashion that pharaohs in Egypt were also representations or reincarnations of gods on earth. And we should also classify this as a religion because Octavian and future Augustuses, future emperors, will also sponsor construction of temples to which people would come to worship whoever the Augustus, whoever the emperor was at the time. Just like, in the past, Greeks had constructed temples for Apollo and for Zeus. And the point here is that the living emperors, they must retain this god-like status. They must be continued to be worshipped as divine. And interestingly, there were no temples dedicated to the emperors built in the city of Rome itself, or even in Italy. And instead, they were kind of strategically placed in these remote parts of the empire. So in places like Gaul, in places like Libya in North Africa, in places like France, right? And the temples were built in those remote places to kind of ensure that people are not raising hell against the emperor, right? We have to secure emperor's legitimacy in the places where it would be easily challenged by the local emperors. Because remember, this is the time when logistics are kind of problem. We don't have a expanded system of roads to which an emperor could just travel and make himself publicly present in a large crowd of people. We don't have radio broadcasting through which a leader could broadcast his message to the leaders, right? To his followers or to the people under their control. So in lieu of that, we have to construct these temples in these remote places to which emperor cannot otherwise come, to make sure that people know who he is and that they can secure obedience through the worship. Now, aside from the creation of state-sponsored religion, Roma et Augustus, or the cult of the emperor, there will be another example of Augustus's state-sponsored propaganda, and that will be that he will start to reach to local celebrities, to local influencers at the time, asking him for support. And in today's world, again, we have things like, radio, we have film, we have posters, we have internet, and all of these various ways in which politicians, leaders might spin the public opinion to kind of turn themselves into this worshipped and loved figures. But in the ancient Rome, in the Roman Empire, the emperors had to get creative, and many Roman poets will be, for that reason, commissioned they were commissioned by the empire, commissioned by the emperor to produce propaganda to glorify Augustus and to glorify his accomplishments. One of the examples will be a poet, a very popular poet in Rome at the time when Octavian Augustus was alive, poet named Horace. And interestingly, during the civil wars in Rome, Horace had actually opposed Caesar. He was against Julius Caesar. And he was a great proponent of Brutus. He was buddies with Brutus, who was one of the main conspirators against Caesar. But with Octavian Augustus in power, he finds himself, as we like to say, on the wrong side of history. He has to side with the victor in this case. So he was kind of schmoozing with Julius Caesar in order to make money. Not with the Caesar, I'm sorry, with Octavian Augustus. And after Caesar's death, Augustus will become friends with Horace, and because that's just how the patron-client system works, right? You can only progress in society, you can climb up the social ladder only if you make buddies with whoever is in power, right? And Horace will be commissioned to write poems celebrating Augustus. And what you see in front of you is one of them. And the excerpt from it reads as, quote, "Blessed leader." This is dedication to Octavian Augustus, I should preface, right? So, blessed leader, bring light to your country again. When your face shines on the people like the shining springtime, then the day itself is more welcoming and the sun beams down more brightly. As a mother with vows and omens and prayers calls to the sun whom southerly wind envious gales have kept from his home for more than a year, lingering there beyond the waves. Of the Carpathian Sea, she who never turns her face away from the curving line of the shore, so smitten with the deep loving of loyalty, the country yearns for its Caesar. O blessed leader, bring Italy endless peace. That's what we say, mouths parched at the start of the day. That's what we say, lips wetted with wine when the sun sinks to rest under the ocean, right? So it seems like Horace had to work really hard to prove that he is loyal to Augustus and goes a bit over the top in praising Augustus's accomplishments. If you read primary sources or when you read primary sources for this week, you will also see these tropes of speaking overly fondly, we might say largely biased in favor of Augustus. Remember, because of this patron-client system in which we have to praise the leader if we want to receive monetary compensation in return. So that's exactly what happens with Horace, and that's exactly an example of how propaganda works in favor of Caesar for the favor of Octavian Augustus for as long as he was alive. Now, aside from promoting or engaging in things like constructing the cult of the emperor, commissioning poets to praise, to, sing songs, write songs for you, closely related to Augustus's propaganda project was also Augustus's attempt to restore Roman traditions and to restore Roman virtues, especially within the Roman family, and especially with emphasizing the worship of family and childbearing. Perhaps this doesn't come to you as a surprise at this point. And in fact, in Roman society, we have this figure called paterfamilias, which is Latin for typically, the eldest man in the family, who traditionally was like the head of the household. And Augustus will claim that the reason everything's wrong with society, we are in this bad situation because we are seeing the power of paterfamilias declining, right? So the root of the problem of the Roman society is the fact that we no longer respect paterfamilias enough, right? And on top of that, he will observe that the upper classes, especially wealthy people, have been slacking in terms of producing Romans, producing offspring. And in fact, many couples from the patrician, from the wealthy families, often did not marry. And, Octavian Augustus will see this as a failure because that meant we are failing to produce offspring. And to change that, to encourage procreation, especially among the wealthy, Augustus will pass the new series of laws that he will call Lex Julia, hoping, again, the purpose here is to elevate both the morals of Romans, bring the respect of paterfamilias, and to procreate, to have more wealthy Roman people, to increase population of the wealthy Italians. And this family and marriage laws was perhaps the most detailed and the most specific of all of the family and marriage laws to date. And of course, it was the most forgiving to those families that chose to have multiple children. For example, the law will demand that all men ages 25 and 60 and all women between 20 and 50 need to marry. It's imperative. And if you are, say, unmarried, or if you are married and do have children, or if you are unmarried and don't have children, and if you are, say, a woman who is a widow and did not marry within 3 years, then you cannot inherit property, right? So there were these obstructions put on you as a person if you were unmarried. Part of Lex Julia will also be this kind of controversial law called the Law of the Three Sons. And in it, according to which, if you had sons, if you had given a birth of three sons, then you had sorts of benefits, including you didn't have to pay taxes, right? Or, for instance, if you were a female enslaved person, you could become a free woman if you are giving a birth to three sons, as if you have control over what sex your baby will turn out to be, right? So we are seeing the rise of privileges to those women and to those families who can procreate a male offspring. To celebrate this new set of laws and to celebrate Pax Romana, this period of peace that Augustus had brought to the empire, state will commission building of the large altar, the image of which you are looking at on a slide, called Ara Pacis. And this altar was kind of built to reinforce this image of the perfect Roman family. On the side of the altar, this is Roma. This is Octavian Augustus right here. This is his wife, Livia. I believe she's called Livia, and this is their daughter named Julia. Julia, the law of Pax Lex Julia was named after their daughter, right? And Augustus's family, if you look at Olivia, she's kind of dressed up in this toga. She is all covered, kind of having the traditional kind of conservative wearing on this, sculpture, if you will. And this was created to kind of showcase that Augustus's family is this model Roman family and example that the rest of the Romans should follow as well. But what majority of Romans did not know at the time was that Octavian Augustus's family actually did not live up to this ideal of image of the family, because his daughter, Julia, after whom the laws themselves were named, will be arrested and she will be exiled because she was being caught in adultery. She was, quote unquote, cheating on her husband because her father, Octavian Augustus, forced her into the marriage with another guy whom she was not in love with in the first place, right? And by the way, on the other side of the Ora Pacis will be the scene of the goddess Pax, the Roman goddess Pax, the Roman goddess of peace, in which she kind of sits in this position and in which she breastfeeds her children, celebrating prosperity, showcasing expectations that the Roman state placed on families to procreate and to also, of course, celebrate motherhood. What should be important takeaway from all of this, from the lecture on Octavian Augustus in particular, is that propaganda project was important component not only of success of the Octavian Augustus, but also he will establish this model of celebrating his life and legacy that many leaders, emperors, kings, statespeople will also follow, because it's been argued that it's been suggested that if people are told things often enough, if people are told same things over and over again, they will eventually start to believe those things, regardless of whether those things are desirable, healthy, or true within the society. And in fact, dictators of the modern history, including people like Joseph Stalin in Russia, people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are modern day examples. Even Hitler in Germany. They will follow the same kind of pattern of propaganda that was established centuries ago by Octavian Augustus. So all of these will adopt propaganda methods implemented and perfected by Octavian Augustus. All right, now for the last part of the lecture, let's I hope fairly briefly, look over at how did Roman state develop after the death of Octavian Augustus, and how will subsequent rulers of the Roman Empire act. And after the death of Augustus, there was a whole spectrum of Roman emperors that followed, ranging from being very good to, being really awful as well. But overall, there were three characteristics of that will continue for the entirety of Pax Romana. First of which was that Rome will continue with its territorial expansion, especially in places like North Europe, places like North Africa, and the Middle East. On top of that, the formal trappings of the Roman system will start to fade away. So we are looking less and less and less like a republic with each subsequent ruler, and more absolutist, right? A position of an emperor will become more and more defined, and emperors will start to claim more and more power. And lastly, post Augustus, the Roman Empire will be characterized by the series of peaks and valleys in which we have a combination of instability, or like crazy leaders, very irresponsible leaders, followed by a series of very competent leaders who will fix the things that previous emperors will kind of mess up, right? And the problem here will be, or the starting problem will be, that Augustus actually wanted to establish a hereditary succession of emperors. So the title of the emperor, he will claim, needs to remain in the same dynasty, needs to remain in the same bloodline that was started by actually Julius Caesar, because remember, Julius Caesar will adopt Octavian Augustus, as the son. And the dynasty of the Augustus's bloodline will be known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, because they will see themselves as, all of them, as the direct successors of Julius Caesar, and subsequently successors of Octavian Augustus also. The problem here, though, was that the members of that very dynasty will, surprise, surprise, scheme against one another. But empire will nevertheless still be kind of able to flourish, because if one line of the rulers had proven to be incompetent or literally crazy, even by the Roman Empire standards, a new line of rulers will kind of come in to take the throne and bring in yet more stability. For example, the two of leaders who will follow Augustus inside of this Julio-Claudian dynasty, Tiberius and Claudius right here, they will be kind of fairly sound and fairly capable administrators. But the same cannot be true of the other two, Caligula right here and Nero, because they will start to make, let's call them, questionable decisions. For instance, you might have heard the story about Caligula. He reportedly will do such things as making a horse his counsel, and he will order Roman soldiers to bring home seashells as a wartime treasures. And Nero, in a similar fashion, he will rule in a similar fashion. Nero was a great grandson of Octavian Augustus. He will come to the throne at the age of 16. He will get a very bad rap, and was fairly infamous for many things, but among others for being extremely paranoid that everybody around him at all times is conspiring against him, and that everybody is eventually going to assassinate him, just like they assassinated Julius Caesar. And he will do such things as, viciously murdering his relatives. He will viciously murder his close associates, including, his family members, like his mother. He will kill his mother, kill his aunt, kill his wife, kill his tutors, and eventually also his generals. And on top of that, Nero had a bad reputation following the incident in Rome called the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. And in 64, there will be a major fire blaze that will break out in a few shops first in the city of Rome itself. And over the next 9 days, almost entire city, well, 2/3 of the city of Rome will be entirely burning down to the ground. Where was Nero? He was the emperor at the time. Where was Nero during the fire? Well, he was not actually in Rome, but rather, on a vacation in his lavish villa located about 40 miles away from Rome. And as you see on the image on the slide, this is replica of it, of what might have happened that night. But he was seen reportedly by the people on the roof of this palace during the fire, playing his instrument, entertaining people, performing all dressed up and singing verses from the Greek epics, because that's what he loved to do. He was a very social person who liked to entertain the masses at his villa. And at the time, many of Romans will start to make assumptions that Nero himself will be the person responsible for the fire in Rome, because he acted so carelessly and he acted so joyfully while the entire city was burning. And now Nero will hear about this fire and he will literally panic. He knew that he might be blamed for the fire. And so, what he will do, he will look for easy targets to blame this disaster on. And at the time, this group that he will blame will be Christians. And at the time, Christians were not the kind of group that you know Christians to be today, spread around the world, largely influential. At the time, in 1st century AD, Christians were just a small group of people literally acting as Jewish religious sect or a cult, a very small group of people, this a religious minority of sorts, as you actually will learn when you come back next week. So more on Christianity and the start of the religion when you come back next week. But for the Romans, or in the eyes of the Romans, Christians were considered literally to be the cult of pagans. And specifically by Nero, he saw them as damaging because they were being disrespectful to the cult of the emperor. So Roma and Augustus, Christians would not do it, and they would not respect traditional Roman religion. So Nero will use this opportunity, this great fire in Rome, to start the first in series of many Christian prosecutions, mainly by public executions using very barbarian, if we should call them this, methods. For example, in terms of Nero and the way he would execute, there is evidence that during the gladiator matches, Nero would literally feed body parts of Christians to the lions, and he will often light his garden parties with the burning carcasses of the Christian human torches of Christian bodies. Now, Nero will use this incident not only to blame Christians for it, but he will use it as an excuse to build Rome in a very extravagant fashion. In fact, There are many historians who claim that Nero will set up this fire intentionally so he can build or rebuild Rome precisely to his liking. And in the following years after the Rome, Nero will use vast amounts of money from the Roman treasury to kind of entirely reconstruct the city, starting with building of his own palace called Domus Aurea, Latin for the Golden House. And this was a massive palace complex that will be stretching over 100-acre plot and eventually take over 1/3 of what used to be the city of Rome itself. So Roman citizens will kind of start to speculate that, Nero will order the Great Fire so he could clean out the land to build the palace of his dreams. Now, what will be the end of Nero? There will be several of generals who were still alive, whom he has not killed yet, who will eventually revolt against him, and they will declare him an enemy of the people. And perhaps Nero will see the end coming soon, and so he will commit suicide. So a very tumultuous reign indeed. So, following this line of, let's call it instability, Rome will actually transfer, or they will eventually transfer into a more stable period that will last for nearly a century. So from 96 to 108 AD, we have the so-called reign of 5 good emperors, indicating exactly that we are entering the period of more stability and peace. And they were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Now, unlike emperors like Caligula and Nero, these 5 emperors will prove themselves to be rather capable and good reformers, trying to stay away from controversies for the most part. And they were successful largely because they will again ensure the peace and stability and peaceful transfer of power amongst themselves as well. And in fact, instead of relying on hereditary succession, which is largely how prior emperors will claim the throne, these 5 great will appoint smart people, usually people like experienced generals, who will, be given the title, say, Nerva will say, Trajan, you have been a good general, and even though we are not related, because you have proven yourself through good service and through good merit, you shall succeed me, right? And so during this period, and speaking of Trajan, Trajan will be very famous because during his reign, Roman Empire will expand. Trajan will conquer for the first time the territory called Britannia, today known as Great Britain, the first time that Romans will come to conquer indigenous people of that island. And later he will also conquer the region of Dacia, which is in today's modern day country of Romania. It will be also Trajan who will actually expand the borders of the Roman Empire to the greatest extent. And Hadrian, who will, of course, succeed Trajan, will help to turn all of these Trajan's conquests into secured Roman possessions. And Britons, the native peoples of the British Isles, will remember Hadrian best because of his wall, the Great Hadrian Wall in North Britain, which Hadrian will build to ensure that this newly expanded empire was actually safe from what Romans thought to be the foreign threats from the north. But just like, all walls around cities, any wall across any territory, the Hadrian Wall too, or the purpose of the Hadrian Wall was to kind of serve as symbol of like means of power and a control that Romans were now establishing in the north of the territory. Also, and lastly, largely associated with the era of 5 good emperors were large infrastructural projects, especially during Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, when we will see a large civics projects and like economic expansion, like wealth being brought to the Roman Empire. And this was the period during which Romans in general will start to perfect what is meant to be Roman architecture. And in fact, if we can kind of claim that the hallmark of the Greek architecture or the hallmark of the Greek culture were things like, philosophy and science, then we should kind of say that Romans during the Roman Empire will surpass Greeks in things like architecture. And since the 2nd century, the emperors will start to hire civic engineers, scientists who will be put in place to address things like, city management, things like sanitation, things like irrigation, widening of the streets, building the drainage systems, and constructing fairly sophisticated sewage systems as well. And part of this project was also the construction of the so-called aqueduct systems. And aqueducts will be the channels and pipes and canals that will supply millions of gallons of water or fresh water for drinking, fresh water for baths, and for irrigation to the highly populated cities across the Roman Empire. And at the time, and still today, we view aqueducts as the hallmarks of Roman architecture. They were the architectural marvels because the structure of the aqueduct needed to be very precisely engineered so that water could flow from its source, either a lake or a river or a sea, through the miles of pipes, the miles of iron pipes into the cities. And this flow of water will not be secured by generators powered by electricity as they might be today, pushing the water from point A to point B. But these were architectural geniuses who will construct these aqueducts through which water would flow through pipes solely using the power of natural gravity and the power of natural slope. And the aqueducts will become feature of many of the Roman cities, including parts of modern-day France, Spain, Greece, North Africa, and Turkey. And the capital city of Roman Empire, Rome itself, will have around 11 aqueduct systems supplying the fresh water for the thousands of people, tens of thousands of people living in the city of Rome. And in fact, despite their age, despite being built so many years ago, some of the aqueducts are still functioning and providing the modern day city of Rome with fresh water. An example is this aqueduct right here in the city of Rome called Aqua Virgo, which is basically a 20-kilometer long aqueduct constructed during the reign of Octavian Augustus. And it actually still supplies water to some of the fountains inside of the city of Rome, which perhaps kind of speaks volumes about a Roman architectural, the architectural durability of these of the aqueducts themselves. And I think that I will stop this lecture today. I'm not sure how long it is so far, but I think this is a good place for us to stop the lecture. And speaking of the legacies of the Roman Empire, the legacies of Roman emperors, some successful, some troubled, some questionable, some very peace-inducing, if you will. And I will be looking forward to seeing you back again next week when we are going to introduce the topic of the rise of Christianity as a part of the Roman Empire. So next week, we are going to kind of return back to the topic of Roman Empire, but we will study it through the lens of the start, development, and spread of Christianity, which will kind of become the predominant religion of the Roman Empire itself. Until then, have a great week. Have a great rest of your week. And I will be looking forward to seeing you back again next time. Bye bye.